All right, everybody, welcome back. Episode 2. All right. I really enjoyed shooting episode 1. I appreciate, the views and the support. I am going to keep doing these because I think it's fun. I'm kind of treating it as like an open experiment where, I'm going to hopefully get better each week, provide a little bit more, get better at doing this every week. So you're kind of coming along with me on this journey. I'm enjoying it. I feel like it's a great way to kind of connect with everybody. So I'm going to keep doing it. And last week we talked about kind of my thoughts on the way I've been programming lately. So I thought I would go today into a little bit more philosophical approach of, why I program the way I do, kind of what's happening with my programming and why things are the way they are. So this episode is going to kind of be all about programming, essentially. So, a couple things to get out of the way first. For the most part, I'm going to say everything works. Working with high school athletes, working with general population clients, training myself. In my experience, sets of 8 on a front squat and sets of 5 on a back squat aren't so horrifically different that you'll get completely different adaptations out of it, right? Like it on some level, it all works, right? And we want to use the weights to serve as a general way to get athletes stronger. So that's kind of where my philosophy comes from. This episode might not be what you expect exactly from All About Programming episode, where we're going to talk about percentages and sets and reps and things like that. Because I don't know how important those things are in the long run. And I know that sounds crazy, but like, unless you are an elite athlete or in a sport like Olympic weightlifting where percentages do matter, it's not something I use a ton. And strength training tools like a barbell and dumbbells and stuff like that are more of a means to an end. So we'll talk about that, but that's kind of the caveat here. If you're hoping for an episode that's like, and then on week 3 we do sets of 75% at, whatever. It's not going to be like that. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So when we talk about a year-long approach, right? If you have an athlete who in ideal world plays one sport, you have clear delineated sections of the year based around their sports season. So you've got your in-season training, you've got your off-season training, you've got, pre-season training, those kinds of things. The further away we are from our season, so for now it's mid-spring here right now as I'm filming this, and so it would be like our fall sports are in their off-season program. The further away we are from an off-season, the more general training is going to be. So what I mean by that is more traditional weight room work. Right now our football team, squats, presses, pulls, general speed work, resisted sprints, those kinds of things, because we're farther away from their season. They don't have a season for another 6 months or so. So we are doing very general training, and the idea is that we want to improve general physical qualities, things like back squat strength, things like their 10-yard dash time, their vertical jump. Like, those are general physical qualities that we want to improve. The further away from the season we are, the more those take a focus. So we want to improve those general physical qualities right now. Now, there is something that I've been thinking a lot lately that is kind of like, the best way to phrase it would be a specificity overload continuum. So the idea being, on one side of the continuum you have overload, on the other side you have specificity. Now, the more you can overload a movement, by nature, the less specific it is to a task. So the more specific it is to a task, by nature, the less you can overload it. For instance, a back squat, you can put a bar on your back, you can get a lot of load on that bar. That is not very specific to running full speed, right? Max velocity running. It helps your leg strength, but it's not specific. So there's overload on one side, and you have specificity on the other. And you can even dial that down into, in a perfect world, if you could perfectly replicate max velocity mechanics with a heavy barbell on your back. Obviously no one can, but let's just say this made up fictional world we live in, somebody can do it. The heavier that barbell gets, even though you are perfectly replicating your max velocity mechanics, the heavier that barbell gets, the less specific it is, because your musculature starts to not act the same way as it does when you're max velocity sprinting, right? You don't get as much elastic return when you hit the ground. You don't get quite the the ground reaction forces acting on it, just because the heavier the load gets, the longer your ground contact time is going to be. I don't care how strong you are. I don't care in this perfect world if, that's something that you can perfectly replicate mechanic-wise. Just the load that you are now experiencing is different. It's not specific to max speed running. And I think that, on a general level makes sense for everybody, right? If you have a baseball pitcher, the most specific thing that you can do is pitch a baseball. Sure, you can, throw heavier balls, but the heavier and heavier a ball gets, the further away from your pitching technique it's going to have to be, just to necessitate getting the ball thrown, right? Like if you have a 20-pound shot, you are not going to throw it the way a pitcher would pitch the ball, right? It just can't happen. And again, even in a perfect world, if you could, the load that 20-pound ball places, as opposed to, however heavy a baseball is, makes it not specific. It is no longer going to have the velocity, the co-contractions, the stability requirements, the speed, those kinds of things. It's not a specific exercise. So we have specificity on one side and overload on the other. We're going to focus more on overload because that is what improves our general, the specific adaptations to opposed demand, the said principle, the principle of overload, like all the things that we associate with typical strength training, we know comes from load, right? We have to overload a movement if we want to adapt to it. So farther away from the season, early in the off season, that's what we focus on, because it doesn't need to be very specific because we're farther away from the off season, or from the season, excuse me. As the season gets closer, we're going to get more specific. So things are going to start moving faster because that's the way sports are played, right? Like obviously a squat is not nearly done at the same speed as, a 5-yard sprint. The muscles used might be similar. The qualities that you gained in increasing your back squat might help, but it doesn't have the speed component. It's not specific. So as the season gets closer, we're going to get more specific. As the season gets closer, we are also going to increase variation. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive because I just talked about specificity, but we want to use a differential learning model where we give athletes access to the largest movement vocabulary that we possibly can, right? So as the season gets closer, exercises get more specific to the demands of the sport, but they also get more varied. So we want to create as stable of a movement library as possible and expose them to a ton of different demands as the season gets closer so that they can use the general physical qualities that they gained early in the off season in a differential way, right? So like when we play sports, we obviously understand that not every rep is going to be the same because you have so many external stimuli happening on a field or on a court that you're never going to do the same repetition twice, essentially. So we want to take the general physical qualities that we gained and have them, basically learn good movement. And we want to use those general physical qualities and improve the way we move on the field, on the court, right? So that is kind of a overarching philosophy. We go from general to specific. We go from overloaded to more specific in terms of how the movements perform, the speed of the movement, the speed of the contractions, those kinds of things. And then as the season gets closer, we also introduce more variety because that's where motor learning is going to take place. So we want to, have as many options available to the athletes as possible. And now when you're doing more overloaded training, you don't have that availability because when you want to overload, let's say like a back squat again, at the end of the day, a squat is a squat. You can load the bar in the front, you can load the bar in the back, you can change tempo, you can mess with reps and things like that and load, but it's not like, because it's very overloaded, it can't be very differentiated. Like it's not specific, and it's also not, a squat is a squat. You can't change that too much. So when we look at exercise selection within that overarching philosophy of programming, it's very similar. We move from general to specific training, and we move from a narrow focus to a wide focus in exercise selection. So like I explained before, we want to increase so we want it first, early in an offseason, we want to increase general physical qualities. We want to get them stronger, jumping higher, running faster, those kinds of things. As we get closer to a season, the exercises are going to start to look more like the sport. So for instance, we might go from a back squat to a single leg squat or like a split squat because as we get closer to the season, unilateral work, single leg work is a little bit more specific than bilateral work, right? We talk about that a lot on social media. You see that all the time. You talk about unilateral training being more sport specific, and that's true. But it's still a squat. It's still heavy. It's not that fast. So as we get even closer to the season, we might move into something like what I call a power step up, where you have a lighter weight in your hand, either like an empty bar on your back or like a pair of dumbbells in your hands, and you step up onto a box, but you hover a few inches above the box, and then you step down with your lower limbs flexed, your ankle dorsiflexed and tension in your calf, and you try to step up as powerfully as possible. So that is more closely related in speed. It is more closely related in the range of motion that we're going to be using. When you run max speed, obviously you have, dorsiflexion in your ankle. When you hit the ground, you're going to have a ton of force acting up from the ground reaction, and a step up is more similar to that than starting on the ground, bilateral back squat, right? But what we might do with that step up is provide tons of variation. So let's say every set or every rep or whatever it is, the box height might change slightly. The load on the bar or the dumbbells might change slightly. And the idea is you are still trying to move as powerfully as possible, but in as many varied ways as possible. That's going to give you that differential learning where you're taking the general physical qualities that we're working on and you're trying to apply them in as many situations as possible. That is, in my opinion, the most specific that we can get to performing well in sport, right? So, and one note here, we use a vertical integration model. So if you're familiar with it, the idea is essentially that nothing ever leaves the program, right? We're still going to do heavy strength training. It's just going not to be the focus of the program. Very low volume. We'll just basically touch on it so that they keep that stimulus and the other things shift towards more of a focus. So that differential learning, that movement pattern learning, those kinds of things that we talked about closer to the season are still taking place early in the off season. They're just not the priority, right? The priority is raising those general physical qualities. As we get closer to the season, we want to take those general physical qualities and we want to transfer them as close as possible to the sport that they're going to play. So, for instance, let's say, we have a basketball player. In my opinion, we have to do our best to ensure that the training that we're doing is going to transfer. So I think for a lot of coaches, it's pretty easy to say, on the Vertec or on the jump mat, I got the athletes on average to jump 4 inches higher this offseason. And the head coach looks at that number and goes, great, we're more explosive. But the issue becomes it's not necessarily specific to the way that they're going to jump in sport. So using that basketball player example, early in the offseason, we might do a bilateral counter movement jump. Basically what you see when you jump on a jump mat, right? You start in a static position, you dip down, counter movement, you jump, you get your jump height. As we get closer to a season, we might move from that general physical quality to a 1-2 jump, an approach jump, right? Where you take one step and it's still, the movement is similar to a counter movement jump, but you now have a step going into it. You have some momentum. You're going to have a ground reaction force when you hit the ground. There's going to be a little bit more elastic return because you have some speed going into the movement, those kinds of things, right? That is slightly more specific than a standing counter movement jump because you're going to do things like that in a game, right? If you go up for a rebound, hardly ever are you just standing there jumping up, right? You're most likely going into that jump at some point. You have horizontal momentum that you then need to transfer to vertical momentum, those kinds of things, right? So that is more specific than the vertical jump. So we're trying to take the increases in the vertical jump that we got early in the off season, move them into a more specific context. Then as we get closest to the season, we might move into a one-leg takeoff jump, excuse me, where every rep is different. You're either taking off differently, you're landing differently, you have a different target height to reach, like something to touch, or you have an obstacle in front of you and you have to kind of navigate those things. Because that is most specific, at least in terms of what we can do in the weight room, to basketball, right? If you only ever did counter movement jumps, you're not going to be prepared for, when you go up for a layup, if you miss and have to get the rebound, you suddenly have to deal with a ground reaction force when you hit the ground. You have to have all these qualities that you haven't been training in terms of tendon stiffness and things like that, where you then have to take off again to grab your rebound. And you're not going to be prepared for that because all you did was a relatively force dominant counter movement jump. In that instance, like, I don't believe that it's our job ends when, we got them to jump higher, right? We need to have that jump height transfer. And in very general training, like a counter movement jump, it's not guaranteed to transfer. Sure, there might be some residual effects if you jump higher that you notice in game. But I think we can do better than that, right? You have your general movements. We want to raise those, right? I'm not saying don't get strong. We want to get stronger, but then we also want to make sure that that strength and that, that vertical jump height or whatever it is, that sprint time is used in a way that's going to be used in the game, right? So we go from general to specific, we go from overload to specific, and then we introduce a lot of variety as we get closer to the season so that they have that ability to learn the movement pattern and learn the movement pattern in as many robust ways as possible. We give them access to a large movement library. So that's kind of why I think the traditional model of periodization doesn't necessarily, it misses the mark. So there's a lot of literature out there about, strength phase, power phase, peaking phase, all these different things. But where I see it come short is that it only talks about the weight room lifts, right? Sure, it's great if you can peak a squat, but you just got really good at peaking a squat. Like, you peaked the wrong thing, in my opinion. You peaked the squat, which, great, like you now have a really high back squat. That's awesome. But it's not what the quality only has so much transfer. So if you spend all your time and energy peaking the squat, you missed, in my opinion, on the opportunity to use the general leg strength that you gained by getting stronger in the squat towards things that are going to matter more, transfer more definitively into the game, right? Like, if you peak your squat, or your bench press, let's say you peak your bench press, and that's great, but you just got really good at doing a bench press. You didn't necessarily transfer it or train it in a way that, or train the movement pattern, I should say, in a way that is going to transfer to whatever the task that you have is, right? The bench press is just a tool. It's not the thing itself that we need to be peaking, right? It's a tool for general strength improvement. You don't need to peak the bench press. So that's kind of where I, think it misses the mark a little bit. It's not that we don't want to get strong. It's just that we want to use the strength as a tool to express the things that are important to us, right? And it's fine, peaking and all that stuff and traditional periodization is fine for general training. But as we get closer to a season, we need to kind of make sure that we are doing it in a way that ensures as much transfer as we possibly can. So that's why we move from general to specific and from overloaded to more specific in terms of speed of movement, co-contractions, how your foot hits the ground, those kinds of things. We want to start replicating that the closer we get to the season. And then we want to give them access to the largest variety of movement possible. So we want them moving powerfully in the terms of like that example I gave at the very beginning with a step up after we did back squats and single leg squats. You want them to be able to use that ability to produce force quickly in a step up in as many varied ways as possible, because that's going to give them that robust movement library that I talked about. And that's going to help prepare them for different situations in the game. So this is a little bit, out of the scope of this episode, but one of the things I'm big on is like movement affordances, right? So the idea is if I can access, a greater degree of, let's say, hip internal rotation to make a cut, right? If I can quickly access a greater degree of hip internal rotation in a variety of different bodily positions in space, I'm going to see the game unfolding differently than someone who can't do that, right? Your brain is incredibly smart and it works faster than you do. If you can't get into a safe position or a stable position to powerfully make a cut, you're not going to be able to see that movement pattern as an option, essentially. What I mean by that is, like, if you can't jump over an obstacle, in the game, you're not going to be like, oh, well, I could jump this, right? Like, it's just not going to be something that enters your brain. You're not going to see the game unfold the same way that somebody who can do that might, right? Because that's the movement affordance that's allowed by, having, like, let's say you can, get, like I said, we'll go back to the example of greater hip internal rotation going into a cut. I know I have the requisite stability and strength and power necessary to get into a deep cut and explode out of it, right? If I have a defender closing in on me, I know that is a movement option that I have subconsciously. I know I can do it because my brain knows that's a safe, stable, powerful position. If I don't have that safe, stable, powerful position, it's not going to register in my brain that I can make that cut, because I know it's not going to be able to happen, right? I'm either going to put myself in danger or it's going to be ineffective. And your brain knows that. It's just not going to let you do it, or it's not even going to show you that that path is a path that's available. So we want to, again, a little bit off topic, but that's why I'm so big on giving them access to as much variety as possible as we get closer to a season. We want to give them as many affordances as possible so that they see the game unfolding. When they see the game unfolding and a situation unfolding, they have 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it is, different ways to solve the movement problem, rather than the one way that we did it the whole off season, right? I hope that makes sense. Again, I got a little bit beyond the scope of this episode. But differential learning and those kinds of things, something I'm super interested in right now. So I'll probably do an episode on that at some point soon, but we're hitting that 20-ish minute mark, so I'm going to wrap it up there. A couple things to keep in mind. Like I said, big takeaways from my programming philosophy. We want to move general to specific. We want to move from overloaded movements to more specific movements in terms of the physiological qualities, like what is happening when you move. And we want to move from pretty, rigid, not a lot of variation, to lots of variation, lots of new experiences. And if you take each exercise and kind of think of it in terms of that way as you move along closer to the season, I think you're going to be in a pretty good spot. So that's going to be it for today. I'm going to wrap it up there. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to hit me up either on social media or you can just shoot me an email. And if you have any topics you want to see covered in these episodes, please let me know. I'm going to do a couple more of just me talking, and then I'm hoping to get some guests on here in the coming months and weeks. So thanks for listening, y'all, if you made it this far, and I will talk to y'all soon. Peace.